So we continue with Professor Peter Nigrovic, which is a great honor for us to host him. And he's a professor of pediatric rheumatology. He's chief of the immunology division at the Boston Children's Hospital. And he's giving us a talk on skin disease in children and adults.
Thank you very much. So thank you all for being here. It's a lovely, wonderful day outside. So you're here instead of being outside. So that's very kind of you. And we're very grateful for the invitation to come and to be here. It's a beautiful place. And it turns out in pediatric rheumatology, Italy has played a very important role, especially in pediatric rheumatology, actually, to think about how we treat our patients, how we think about Still's disease and MAS. A lot of that work has actually come here out of Italy. So I will be citing a lot of Italian papers along the way. And I wanted to thank Giorgia in particular. So this is where we were in 2016, where we were together in Padua, where I was visiting Professor before. And so it's wonderful to have a chance to be back again. Okay, so these are my disclosures. I will talk a little bit about the role of interleukin-1, and some of these companies have asked me to consult because of my work on this condition. You'll have to judge for yourself if I'm influenced or not influenced. I will do my best not to be influenced. Okay, so we should start off with a case. So we have here an 11-month-old boy with fever and rash. So we heard a little about fever. This is a little bit different case. So this child had previously been well and had 3 weeks of high fever to over 39 degrees daily. So at this, I should probably start the clock, but I got it on my watch. I'm good. So this boy was irritable, pale, non-toxic, had fever, tachycardia, tachypnea, had knee effusions in both knees, and then had this rash over the face, trunk, and arms. And it's a little bit faded up there, unfortunately, because of the lights. But you can see that the rash is sort of splotchy, it's red, it's located in what we'd call intertriginous areas. So areas like this trunk and proximal extremities. So the child had a leukocytosis with a polypredominance, was mildly anemic, had high platelets, had a high CRP, a positive D-dimer, and high ferritin. And this is no question what this is really at the time. This is a syndrome we recognize as what we call systemic juvenile idiopathic arthritis, or systemic JAA. And the fever curve of the patient when we admitted to the hospital, you can see here. And so you can imagine a line at 37. And you can see the fever goes above and then down below and then above and below. And this is a typical, what we call a quotidian pattern, typically meaning a spike once a day or twice a day. The pattern isn't that informative, but that's what we mean when we talk about a quotidian fever. So the features of systemic JA are fever, rash, and arthritis. Those are the three canonical features. And so these are, to get a sense for how common those features are, I'd pulled here from a chapter we wrote some time ago about looking at 3 series of stills of this systemic JA from 1992, from 2003, and 2013. And here you can see that a reasonably large series. You look at the age of onset. The age of onset of these patients is typically 6 and below. That's the peak of onset of this condition, although it can happen at any age. Female, males about similar in prevalence, which is unlike other kinds of juvenile arthritis, which are mostly female predominant. You see that essentially everyone has fever. Rash is present in most patients, but not everyone. And arthritis historically has not been present in everyone. You see that in the earlier series that there are 88% or 80% of patients have fever. Now in the later series it says 100%, and that's because the definition changed. So by the definition used, everyone had arthritis, but that's really not how the disease is. The disease is mostly arthritis at onset, but not all. And some people never go on to arthritis. So you see a very similar picture if you look at the adult series. So these are, again, 4 adults, patients with adult onset Still's disease, defined as onset above the age of 16. And so you can see here, again, the patients are relatively young for adults. If you looked at rheumatoid arthritis, you might see an older population. But here, the age of onset was typically in the 20s and 30s. Some are older. Again, female, male, pretty similar, a little different in the Japanese series, but again, very similar numbers. So essentially everyone has fever. Most patients have rash, but not everybody, and most patients, but not everybody, has arthritis. So that's the kind of clinical picture, very similar. So why is it that we call one side systemic JAA and the other side we call adult onset Still's disease? And I think the reasons are entirely historical and not at all biological. And let me just tell you why I think that. If you look at why we use the definitions we use in pediatrics, where does this age 16 cutoff from? It comes essentially from this single paper published in 1959 from two of the parents of the field of pediatric rheumatology, Barbara Ansel and Eric Bywaters. And they at that time were describing their patient population in a particular clinic that was a little bit east of London called Taplow. And so in this clinic, the nurses said that the patients could only be 16 and under. So they said that was the patient population that they had. And so that's what the definition that they used. And so essentially the reason we use 16 is because of the nursing requirements of a small clinic outside of London in the 1950s. In this, even Bywaters and Ansel said later on, this is entirely arbitrary. There's nothing specific about this headline. Yet this age of 16 cutoff has translated throughout our whole nomenclature. So if you follow on the graph from 1959, when this paper was published, to the 1970s, when we first had the definition of juvenile rheumatoid arthritis in the United States and juvenile chronic arthritis in Europe, that age 16 cutoff persisted. And then that persisted into the ILAR criteria in 1997, and more recently, the Printer criteria here out of Italy use an 18th birthday cutoff. But again, that has no data. So there's no data for any cutoff at any of these diseases. And so we should realize that it's entirely convention, not biology. And so we should look at these conditions and say, are they the same or are they not the same? And so we've already looked at the clinical features and they're very similar. What about the lab features? So one of the key markers that we'll talk about a little more is IL-18. This is an IL-1 family member, and it is a remarkable. It's an inflammasome product. It's an interferon gamma inducer, and it's interestingly characteristically elevated in Still's disease, or what we'll call this family of diseases. So if you look on the left here, you can see IL-18 in inactive systemic JA, active systemic JA, and MAS. So this is a patient paper we published a few years ago. And the dotted line is the upper limit of normal. And you can see that even in patients with inactive Still's disease, the IL-18 is usually very high. And that's a log scale on the y-axis. So it's actually quite high. If the disease becomes more active, the numbers go up. And if you go to MAS, macrophage activation syndrome, all the numbers are up. So it's elevated, but very characteristically in this condition. If you then look at the adults, which is on the opposite side here on the right side, you can see that same pattern persists. So here, this is looking at adult onset Still's disease versus rheumatoid arthritis versus control. Again, IL-18 is very specifically elevated, and that looks very similar. And if you can get same kind of data on ferritin, D-dimer, interleukin-1, IL-6, interferon gamma, S100 proteins, and NK cell dysfunction, all characteristics of this syndrome, and all very similar in adults and children. So are they the same? Yes, they're the same. Not each patient may be a little different from the other, but as a ballpark, it's all one syndrome across the spectrum. And indeed, that's how it was originally described. So Bywaters was the first person to describe Still's disease in the adults. And what he wrote in that paper was, this paper sets out to show that the Still's disease syndrome occurs also in adults. It was intended to be the same syndrome. And fortunately now, in work headed by Bruno Fotrella and Fabrizio De Benedetti, this is now, I think, locking itself into our nomenclature again, where systemic JAA and AOSD are the same disease that should be designated by the same unique name, namely Still's disease. And I'll try to use that name going forward. Okay, but what kind of disease is Still's disease? So it has fever, it has rash, arthritis, and systemic inflammation. So it's also males equals females, it's children more than adults, and it responds to IL-1 blockade. And this is a kind of a signature that we sometimes see in a family of diseases that are called autoinflammatory diseases. So, and it's often called a polygenic autoinflammatory disease for that reason. And I'm going to just caution you that I don't necessarily agree with that. But let me talk about what that means. So if we think about immunity in immunology more generally in animals, all animals have to protect themselves from being eaten by bacteria and viruses and other kind of invaders. And so if you look here on a scale of evolutionary time, going from 900 million years ago to present, you can see that this graph depicts where different species diverge from each other. What you'll see is that in the species down below, insects and below, for example, you have what's called innate immunity. There are hardwired protections where these organisms all recognize danger signals. So you may know toll-like receptors or other kind of receptors that tell you when something foreign is present. Starting with the jawless fishes, you start to develop a new kind of mechanism where we can now rearrange our DNA to generate clonal memory. And so this is, for example, T-cell recombination. So why do you have a T-cell? Why are T-cells different from other T-cells? Because they've able to clonally recombine their T-cell receptor, and the ones that are selected forward go forward. That's the mechanism of clonal immune memory, similarly with B cells. And so, and typically the diseases that we think of as autoimmune are diseases where this system has gone wrong, where we're starting to recognize not just foreign targets like bacteria and viruses, but also self targets. So that autoimmune diseases are diseases of endogenous antigens. By contrast, autoinflammatory diseases are diseases where the immune brakes are slipping, where it's not a particular target you're recognizing, but something in the mechanism overall is just not breaking itself appropriately. And these are often antigen-independent inflammation, and those are now called autoinflammatory diseases. Now, most of our diseases actually are somewhere in the middle. They have some autoinflammatory component and some immune component. So the question is, where is Still's disease? And so I think, although it has those features that make you think that it's not antigen-directed, I think there's some evidence to say that it's not all autoinflammatory. One is that it doesn't really occur in very young kids. So diseases like NOMID, for example, are really early onset immune disorders. Those can occur very early in life, and that does not happen in this disease. This disease spares the first 6 months of life. It doesn't have any obvious heritability, so it doesn't seem to run in families. And interestingly, it often goes away. So we don't know exactly what numbers are, but this is a long-term series of patients followed for 30 years in a Scandinavian cohort, and something like 80% of patients are in remission at that time, in very small numbers. There's also other evidence. So the largest GWAS study, genome-wide association study of this condition, found that the most prominent region in the genome linked to Still's disease is actually the HLA. As you know, the HLA is the place where antigens are presented. So this HLA signature is the hallmark of an autoimmune disease. So RA has an HLA signature, lupus has one, diabetes has one, but a disease like gout, which is sort of autoinflammatory in some ways, does not. So I think that that's good evidence. And then for us, so I take care of patients, but I also have a lot of mice in our lab. And so one of the evidence that struck me that made me think that we should think about this condition differently is this particular model of mouse arthritis. So these are mice that are engineered to lack a particular receptor, a particular protein called the IL-1 receptor antagonist. This is the blocker of IL-1 signaling, and it's essentially anakinra, the medicine anakinra, but in endogenous form. And so if you take mice that in a particular background that are wild type, of course they don't have arthritis, but if you knock out this receptor, they all develop arthritis. And it turns out this arthritis, which you might think would be autoinflammatory, is in fact strictly T-cell derivative. So if you transfer T-cells to an animal that doesn't have T-cells, it'll give arthritis specifically from those T-cells. It's really an immune-mediated, an adaptive immune-mediated disease. So these considerations made us think about the biology of Still's disease differently. And we were wondering whether there might be kind of phases of disease. And we call this the biphasic hypothesis. And this accounts for the fact that very often early on patients have fever and rash and arthritis, but almost no arthritis or mild arthritis. And then there's this late phase where the fever and rashes often go away, and you have a chronic, terrible arthritis that's very difficult to manage. And so the idea we had was that maybe in the early phase, IL-1, which we know is going to be relevant, we'll talk about that therapeutically, is involved in doing things that are more innate-like activating endothelial cells or recruiting leukocytes or activating cells within the joint. But at the same time, it's acting on T cells to change T cell programming, including changing what T regulatory cells do and favoring differentiation of Th17 cells, which we wondered might be pathogenic. So this is sort of the genesis of the idea. So we'll see where some of that has led in terms of treatment. So the reason we are concerned about Still's disease, particularly when we take care of these patients, is because of that chronic arthritic phase. So disease can be either monophasic, which means one episode that lasts 12 to 24 months and then stops, never see it again. Intermittent, which is a phase that stops, you're off therapy, and then it happens again and maybe again. And then persistent. Persistent is typically a phase where you have a systemic inflammation that usually fades over time, and you have this chronic arthritic phase. And if you look in these series over time, this is 8 historical series, the persistent is the most common course, and in every series it's over 50%. So that's the terror of this disease in many ways, that kind of chronic, horrible arthritis. And the first glimpse that we could do something about this came from Virginia Pasquale, who's now at Cornell. At that time was in Texas. And she observed in patients with Still's disease that you could use anakinra, which is, again, this recombinant IL-1 receptor antagonist, and you could knock down the fever in almost all children, and then you can blunt the arthritis. These were mostly chronic arthritic patients. So that sort of set the stage for thinking about this disease a little differently and trying new therapies, because most kinds of arthritis don't respond like this. And so in 2006, we saw a patient who was an 8-year-old girl with 6 months of fever and rash. She hadn't developed arthritis. She had SED rate of 85, ferritin of 10,000, and had no really good options for treatment among the things we had at the time. She had failed nonsteroidals. She was obese, so we didn't want to use steroids. She had fatty liver, so we didn't want to use methotrexate. And we then initiated anakinra monotherapy on her and obtained an immediate clinical remission. So this is interesting, right? This is no steroids needed treatment of Still's disease. And so at that time, we gathered a series to see what other people were doing. And so I sent out an email to friends and family, more or less to say, anybody doing this using our listserv? And together we gathered an international series of 46 patients where anakinra, IL-1 blockade, had been used as part of the first-line therapy for all these conditions. And in this series, we observed that about 60% of patients had a complete response to therapy, including 8 out of 10 who had been treated like our patient, where it was the only therapy that was used. And of the rest, most of them had at least a partial response. Fever and rash were particularly susceptible to improvement. They almost all went away. And this chronic persistent arthritis that we had seen in about half of our patients was only about 11% of patients treated in this way, which looked encouraging to us. But of course, this is retrospective. So encouragingly, around the same time, the group in Utrecht was doing very much the same kind of thing, and they were doing it systematically on all their patients. They were collecting the data prospectively. And what they observed was as follows. In 45 patients with new onset systemic JA, they tried nonsteroidals first. They almost always failed, like they almost always do. And then they used anakinra without steroids initially, with escalation as needed. And what they found was as follows: 55% were inactive within 30 days, 71% at 90 days, 76% at a year. Almost 70% never needed any steroids. And at 5 years, something like 96% were off medicines, including many who were off medications altogether. 96% were in remission, and 72% were off medications. So these are outcomes of a kind we've never seen before in this condition. So there are other drugs that also work for this condition. So these are patients with chronic disease, not new onset disease. And these are 2 papers published back to back in the New England Journal in 2012. One is we're using canakinumab, which is an anti-IL-1 beta antibody, and the other is using tocilizumab, which is a blocker of IL-6. It blocks the IL-6 receptor. And what you can see in the graphs is a quite remarkable response rate. So for the rheumatologists in the audience, when we think about you have a patient with rheumatoid arthritis and you give them a TNF inhibitor like adalimumab, what you know is that about 50% of patients are going to have a 50% response. That's very common across all our drugs, all our biologics. And what's remarkable here is here the 50% bar is at ACR 90. That's 90% better in 50% of patients. So really remarkable outcome in both these drugs, both IL-1 blockade and IL-6 blockade. So why not try just nonsteroidals or steroids first? First is that they're unlikely to work, so 3 out of 45 is not good odds. And the second is that steroids are indiscriminate. If you have a response to steroids, it doesn't really tell you much. So tumors respond to steroids, infections respond to steroids. It just causes a problem later. But in terms of steroid response, it's not very effective at diagnosing. But in terms of IL-1 blockade, it actually seems to be quite specific. So if you have a patient with fever and you give them IL-1 blockade and the fever stops, then you have a very high likelihood that that is the disease you think it is, which is Still's disease. If you treat a patient with infection or leukemia or lymphoma with steroids, you usually have done harm. You make them more vulnerable to side effects, or you make them you put them in a different therapeutic category of their cancer, or you may make their infection worse. And it turns out anakinra doesn't do any of these things. So it was originally developed for sepsis trials, and in fact, it doesn't work all that well for sepsis, but it doesn't make people worse. So you're not going to make an infection worse using a short course of IL-1, and it doesn't affect fevers from leukemia or lymphoma at all. Once you start steroids, it's very hard to stop them. So we tend to trickle down our steroid dose. And in fact, in the pre-biologic era, if you look at what was happening in Canada, about 70% of patients with Still's disease were still on steroids 6 to 9 months after onset of disease. So we were historically using a lot of steroids. And of course, there's the idea of this window of opportunity. Maybe we can treat early. If we treat early, we can change fundamentally the biology of the disease. And that may be different than worse. So that's, again, this biphasic hypothesis. The idea is if you intervene early, maybe you stop that later phase. And this is an idea that I think, we still don't know if it's true, but the idea has sort of caught on. And there are evidence both in mice and in humans. So this is some evidence we generated in the lab. We used that IL-1 receptor antagonist knockout mouse that I talked about, and we either used the anti-IL-1 beta early, or we used it late. So we let the arthritis establish itself, or we didn't. And in both cases, if you look in the graphs, the red bar of late treatment works. The little light blue bar of early treatment really suppresses disease very uniformly. But if you look at in the joints and look at this development of these pathogenic cells, these IL-17 positive cells, in the wild type mice, of course, they don't have any. In the mice treated with control, you see a lot of these cells develop. In the ones treated late, where the arthritis is getting better, but you still see those cells have developed. You've allowed yourself to develop this pathogenic population. But in the ones you treat early, those cells don't develop. That's sort of the idea here. So, these are mice. What happens in humans? So here, working with Lauren Henderson, who's now a principal investigator at Boston Children's, but at that time was sort of a trainee with us. She looked at new onset systemic JA patients and chronic systemic JA patients. And she looked at by RNA sequencing at the genes expressed by different kinds of by cells. And she was looking for this Th17 signature. And what she showed was that this Th17 signature, where that big green bump is, that's the accumulation of positive genes, as it were, positive mRNAs for IL-17 associated therapies in T regulatory cells. That's where she saw the signature first. And then in the chronic phase, that shifted to the T effector cell population. So you'd see these Th17 skewing. And if we used anakinra right away at the beginning, that signature didn't develop. So this is the bar in this, the y-axis here is the percent of patients of T regulatory cells in this early phase that develop this IL-17 signature. You can see in the red, the early onset phase, the purple, the treatment with anakinra, and some control patients down in gray. So now, again, this is all correlative. It doesn't say that the hypothesis is correct, but at least it's consistent with the hypothesis. And that does seem to fit with the current practice pattern of what we're seeing in these patients. So this is data from Fabrizio De Benedetti's group in Rome. And what he looked at was 56 patients with systemic JA treated with anakinra at different times in their course. And the y-axis is the percent of patients in remission off steroids at 6 months. And the x-axis is the duration from onset of disease to the start of anakinra. And what you see is the patients that were treated early within the first 3 months of disease had something like a 92% response rate of being off steroids by 6 months. And the patients where the therapy decision was delayed is now down to 37%. Now, what distinguishes one population from the other, I don't know. This is not a randomized controlled trial of early versus delayed therapy, and there's probably other differences here. But at least it's consistent with the idea that if we treat early, at least for a good chunk of our patients, we will do much better than if we delay. And of course, if the patients are not on steroids, which we know as pediatricians that steroids are bad for growth, then we have lots of benefits from our patients. So there's evidence now for adult rheumatologists that this is true as well. So this is a paper published last year looking at patients collected from multiple centers across Germany with new onset, adult onset Still's disease. And they looked at patients who were treated with conventional therapy, things like methotrexate and steroids, and patients who got biologics as part of their first response. And they looked to see how they did, and what the primary analysis was sustained event-free remission in those patients, and the odds ratio was 7.2 in patients who got the early biologic therapy. They had less, also highlighted down below, was they had less glucocorticoids in general. They were able to stop glucocorticoids better. So at least the correlative evidence, I think, is strong that this is a better strategy. And that, in fact, is now the recommendation. This is, again, from Fabrizio De Benedetti and Bruno Fotrell's recommendation panel, in which I was a member. And one of the recommendations is that an IL-1 or an IL-6 inhibitor should be initiated as early as possible when the diagnosis is established. To be clear, we don't have very much evidence on IL-6 at all. Just the assumption is that they're pretty much the same. We don't really know that. Okay. So for the rest of the time, I want to talk about a complication of this condition that we sometimes see. We see in about 20 to 30% of patients. And I think this is something that we should recognize as pediatricians. We should recognize as pediatric residents. And it probably has relation to very sick patients in the ICU as well. So this is a 11-month-old boy. This is our 11-month-old boy, right? This was in 2001 when I saw that child. And at that time, we were not using anakinra. We were using steroids and naproxen. And he was on those therapies, and he came back a week later, and he looked gray. He was ashen. He had very large liver and spleen. I still remember the examination. His hematocrit had dropped from 29 to 17. His platelet count had dropped from elevated, where it was supposed to be, he's inflamed, down to low. His sed rate had dropped, and it dropped because he was consuming fibrinogen. As you may remember, what drives the sed rate is that the liver is stimulated by things like IL-6 and IL-1 and TNF to make fibrinogen, and that sandwiches between these negatively charged red blood cells. They form these rouleau columns, and those fall faster. If you consume your fibrinogen, for example, in disseminated intravascular coagulation, your sed rate will actually paradoxically fall because you're not making these rouleaux. So his liver tests had gone really high, and his ferritin had also gone really high. So this is macrophage activation syndrome, or MAS. So this is a condition which is often called a hemophagocytic syndrome, and that's because of what you see in the bone marrow. If you do a bone marrow biopsy in these children, you can see cells like what are present on the right. These purple, the cells here are stained is purple are macrophages, and the blue are nuclei of all the cells that they've started to eat. You don't need to show that these are there. It's not diagnostically necessary or sufficient, but this is what a common concomitant of this condition. These patients have persistent fever. They have elevated liver function tests with hepatosplenomegaly. They're in disseminated intravascular coagulation, so thrombocytopenia, anemia, elevated D-dimers, falling sed rates. And they have systemic toxicity with heart failure, seizures, renal failure, and acute respiratory distress syndrome, and they have a substantial mortality. So what's going on in this syndrome? And I think a good way to think about it is to think about the way that the immune system normally regulates itself. So you can imagine an antigen-presenting cell here on the right, a macrophage or a dendritic cell. And on the opposite side, you see a killer cell, like a CD8 cell in particular, or an NK cell, or a CD4 T cell. Now, these cells have ways to talk to themselves and to talk to each other that are activating. So you can see here that the macrophage can make IL-6 and IL-1, and it can respond to those. So it can activate itself. It can also present antigens to the CD8 T cells and make all the different kind of chemicals that are mentioned above, chemokines or cytokines, that drive those cells to become more activated, including more recently defined interferon 1 and IL-15, as well as IL-18. And in turn, these CD8 T cells make interferon gamma, which causes the macrophages to make even more of those things. So you have here potentially a vicious cycle, where one cell stimulates the other cell to stimulate the first cell. And the reason this doesn't spiral out of control is because there's also a break. And that break is that the CD8 cell will kill the cell that it's doing the antigen presentation. So it will be able to calm the whole process down because there's a negative feedback loop built in. And what happens in macrophage activation syndrome is that for some reason, this loop keeps going. The block is broken. And that may be because of genetic defects. So in neonatology, you see things with, for example, perforin deficiency, where the CD8 cells are missing the protein that it needs to kill the macrophage. And so this is called familial hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis. It's a set of conditions, genetic conditions, in which the break is missing, and these patients present usually with florid MAS. You can also drive the system with strong stimulants. You can do this in the mouse, for example, with toll-like receptor ligands. We think Still's disease activity with cytokines also does this. And probably can do this also with a very heavy antigen load. So infection, including viral infections, as well as tumor burden. So we see this in cancer. There was a very nice paper published earlier this year by Scott Canna's group, which helps us think a little bit more in detail about this. So what you see here in the video is a killer cell in green and attacking a target cell, which is sort of turning red. And so the video is going to scroll over and over again. When the T cell approaches its target cell, it explodes green. That's a calcium indicator that says the T cell has seen its signal. It's seen its counterpart. And so it activates, and then it starts to deliver a killing signal to the target cell, which then turns progressively red. This is it's making what's called an immune synapse with that cell, through which it's delivering perforin and causing death of the cell. And the duration of the immune synapse depends on the fact that the cell is killed and then withdraws. It undergoes apoptosis. It's pulling itself back. That terminates the immune synapse. And so if you have a cell, the killer cell that's missing either one out of the two copies of perforin or both copies of perforin, you can see that the immune synapse goes on longer and longer, and it goes on longer with heterozygous response. And then if you have no perforin at all, the immune synapse essentially is permanent. The T cells keeps trying to kill its target cell, but can't quite get there. And so it cannot terminate the interaction. And if you look at the implications of that, you see more and more interferon gamma. So the plot on the right has concentration of interferon gamma on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And so blue is the wild-type cells, killer cells. Red is the ones that are missing one copy of perforin, so have less perforin around. And the green is no perforin. You can see the interferon gamma rise progressively over time. Now, you can also see that if the target cell is resistant to death, so if the target cell doesn't want to undergo apoptosis, you will also see prolonged synapse. So here they used bone marrow-derived macrophages as their target cell. They immortalized some of them using cancer genes. And you can see the immune synapse length goes up and the interferon gamma response goes up. So target cell death resistance also gives you more interferon gamma. So another way of thinking about what's going on in MAS is what turns this pair into an interferon gamma generator. And interferon gamma is the pathogenic cytokine here, or at least one of them. And it includes impaired killing on the part of the CTL, either genetic or acquired. So for example, high levels of IL-6 block perforin expression by T cells, and so they make those cells more have a harder time killing. By contrast, you can have a target cell that's difficult to resist. Again, it may be made resistant by some chemicals in the milieu, or it may be, for example, intrinsically resistant because, for example, it's a cancer cell. And IL-18, I should just point out, is an amplifier of interferon gamma production, so increases the interferon gamma in all these contexts. So if we think about children versus adults with the macrophage activation syndrome across the world, as rheumatologists, of course, we know our focus is Still's disease. But in fact, that's actually a minority of the MAS that's out there. So here are graphs of pediatric and adult MAS, what are the diseases that trigger them, and the red triangle at the bottom is rheumatic diseases. So it's about 10% or so in both groups. But you can see in pediatrics that the most common cause is actually infection, and in adults, the most common cause is malignancy. But all these causes, infection and malignancy, rheumatic, inborn errors of immunity, these can be seen in both adults and kids. And so when we think about the differential diagnosis of a patient who presents with macrophage activation syndrome, this is the kind of differential diagnosis we have to think of, including in particular infection and malignancy. So this kind of circle, this vicious cycle also gives us clues on how to make a diagnosis, because you can measure a lot of these markers. So, for example, the activated macrophages, especially when they're starting to eat red blood cells, we think, they can release a lot of ferritin. And ferritin is a very useful marker. It's an inflammatory marker in general, but it goes way up in these conditions to the tens of thousands very often. You have interleukin 18 is a chemical made by, a cytokine made by macrophages, which helps drive the spiral, and we can measure that. Soluble IL-2 receptor is something released by the T cells when they're activated. So T cells need IL-2. When they're activated, they express an IL-2 receptor so that they can recognize that signal and start to reproduce. But in order to stop that signal, they cut it off, and you have soluble IL-2 receptor released. So that's something we can measure. And CXCL9, interferon gamma itself is hard to measure. You can measure it, but it's harder to measure. CXCL9 is a great proxy for that. And actually, that was defined by Claudio Bracaglia in Rome. So how do we differentiate active Still's disease from MAS? And so here again, this is a graph I showed you earlier when we were looking at IL-18. But here I want to show you ferritin, IL-18, CXCL9, and C-reactive protein. And again, the three categories are inactive Still's disease, active Still's disease, and macrophage activation syndrome. And what you see here is that ferritin rises in active disease and rises a lot in MAS. It's a pretty good marker. IL-18 is elevated at baseline in most of these patients anyway, but again goes way up, and very high levels are also a very sensitive sign of macrophage activation syndrome. CXCL9 shows you that it's a marker of having interferon gamma around. There's kind of an interferon gamma switch that flips. So inactive versus active Still's disease have very similar levels of interferon gamma around. But when you go into the MAS spiral, then all of a sudden you flip the switch and you have this around. But by contrast, C-reactive protein is actually not a marker of MAS compared to a marker of active Still's disease. It does not distinguish one from the other. So we can use these also in patients that we're monitoring over time to predict the onset of Still's disease. So here, and as well as its course. So here's a series published earlier this year out of the Netherlands, looking at their longitudinal cohort of systemic JA. And what they found was that if you looked at the different markers, what the graph here depicts ferritin on the top, interleukin 18 on the bottom. The red arrow points to the onset of Still's disease. That's when the onset of MAS, that's when the diagnosis is made. And the two before it are a week before or 2 weeks before, then a month before, and a diagnosis. So what you see is just in the weeks leading up to the MAS diagnosis, ferritin is gradually rising, as is IL-18. And these are markers that we can follow in the clinic that can help tell us, should we be worried about the disease coming soon? And when we see the patients, we can also use these markers to tell us how worried we should be about them. So this is a work just recently published looking at predictors of how long MAS is going to last. So once MAS starts, it's often a very difficult process to shut down. You use a lot of steroids, a lot of other medicines, and it often lasts months before it's gone. So these investigators looked to see whether the labs at the baseline predicted whether it was going to be more than 2 months before remission or less than 2 months. And they observed that in patients, especially that were going to do pretty well, so that's in the clear bars, in the black bars, the ones that were going to be remission early, that they mostly had CXCL9 under 830 and an IL-18 under 83,000. So those are sort of rough markers we can use. Now, the values from lab to lab vary. And I wouldn't hang yourself on these numbers, but I would say that in general, very high CXCL9 and very high IL-18 tell you you're in for a long road ahead, and you have to plan for several months of condition. Okay, so you can use this spiral also to tell you what treatment options there are. So you can block steroids. We use steroids for everybody, and they sort of shut everything down because steroids block NF-kappa B and many other immune pathways, and they shut all these pathways down. Anakinra blocks IL-1, which is involved in the self-stimulation and in the stimulation of the T cells. Anakinra, as your JAK inhibitors, can also block things like type 1 interferons, which are involved in that afferent axis. The CD8 T cells themselves can be antagonized via calcineurin inhibitors. So this is things like cyclosporin and tacrolimus. JAK inhibitors block IL-2, which is an axis where the T cells use to stimulate themselves. Etoposide chemotherapy kills those rapidly dividing T cells that are important here as sources of interferon gamma. And then interferon gamma itself can be blocked either using JAK inhibitors or emapalumab. And emapalumab really is the new kid on the block here and can be very effective in this condition, although unfortunately is extremely expensive. So just to wrap up, I just want to say what I do in 2025 about MAS. And this is an algorithm that's published. You can take a look at it and see whether it's something that you would like to do here. And I'm sure everyone has their own practice. So there are just not data that are equivalent to what Lise was presenting earlier about, do this versus do that. This is better. There just aren't that number of patients and aren't that number of studies. So this is the general thing that I do. So I just want to point out that it's a small evidence base. It's not really standard of care. It varies with circumstances. So let's go to the different parts. So if you suspect cells-associated MAS, you check MAS labs, like we talked about, IL-18, CXCL9, ferritin, soluble IL-2 receptor. Consider alternate diagnoses. So think about leukemia in a child or lymphoma, particularly in an adult. And then we usually use prednisone at high doses, usually methylprednisolone pulses, 30 milligrams per kilogram in a child or a gram in an adult, plus anakinra, usually at high doses. So many patients actually do respond to that, especially in Still's disease. But some don't. And at that point, there's no evidence on what's the right next response. But what we do typically is use ruxolitinib, which is a JAK inhibitor. So JAK inhibitors block the signals that are downstream, the intracellular pathways that are downstream of type 1 interferons, type 2 interferons, that is interferon gamma, IL-15 and IL-2, and IL-6. So you can block all those pathways at once, and I like that as a combination. But you could easily use emapalumab here. That's a very reasonable next step as well. And if we don't get a response, we then go to tacrolimus. Sometimes we add IVIG. Data for that's very weak. And EBV, if the problem is a virus, you can actually get rid of some of the virus-infected cells with rituximab in EBV-associated disease. If that doesn't work, we use emapalumab. We would stop ruxolitinib, although the oncologists wouldn't necessarily do that. So we aren't yet comfortable with that toxicity profile, although it's probably safe. But we continue anakinra and tacrolimus, and if that doesn't work, then we go to chemotherapy to really try to destroy all the rapidly dividing cells, certainly with the help of our onc colleagues. Okay, so no, again, this is what we do, and this is why we do it. And what you should realize is that the data are pretty limited. And so there's a lot of finger feel in how we respond, how fast you move from one step to the other, and what you do. Okay, so what I wanted to I'll finish what we talked about. So we talked about the Still's disease is a spectrum across adults and children. Most of our diseases are that way, probably in pediatric rheumatology. There may be one exception in childhood and a few exceptions in childhood. What is different about children and adults is, of course, treatment, in the sense that children need dosing to be a little different, need to have less steroids, and need to be more aggressive on treatment in general in children. We use, in terms of treatment for Still's, we use biologics first, and you've seen the evidence for that. It's not 100% conclusive, but it's good enough for me, and certainly that's how I would treat myself. That's how I treat my patients. And then for MAS, just think about the diagnosis, and then to treat early and aggressively.